Hello, welcome. My name is SlugMTG, and today I'm going to be talking about building budget commander decks. I've been getting an itch lately to add a new deck to my collection, but as I was looking at decks and cards, I quickly realized that a lot of cards that used to be my budget are completely out of it now. Some of these cards are getting ridiculously expensive. So I decided, let's change things up a little bit, and instead of brewing a full complete list, let's go ahead and see how cheap I can make a commander deck. I ended up building one for around $25, and I actually had a lot of fun doing it. So after building 10 or so decks around $25, I've learned a few things about what to look for, what to keep an eye on, and I have definitely found that there are certain strategies to stick to get the most bang for your buck. So the first tip that I have for everybody is stay away from flavor of the month commanders. I'm talking about legendary creatures that the second they get spoiled, the community goes absolutely nuts for. Recently, there's Gavi and Nethroi, although Teysa Karlov and Yuriko are also a few examples of decks that were built to death when they were initially revealed. The reason for this is that the high synergy cards for these decks will get scooped up immediately, and unless you want to try building a deck without some of the most key cards in it, it's just not going to be possible to stick to a tight budget building under these commanders. You may be able to build the decks eventually, but at least for the first 6 months or so, the key cards are going to be expensive, and they aren't going to come down until people start to take the deck apart. There are some exceptions for this. I'm talking about generic value commanders such as Muldrotha, Chulane, and Atraxa. The biggest cost to these decks will most likely be the commanders themselves, and because they can be pulled in so many different directions, there will be a budget option for them, and they are completely viable. So if you open up the commander, trade for the commander, just know that a budget option for them is still 100% viable. Just maybe not for some of the flavor of the month commanders that fit a more niche strategy, and their key cards are going to skyrocket in price. The second tip that I have is learn to use Scryfall effectively. If you don't know what Scryfall is, it is a very useful search engine specifically for Magic cards. It is my personal favorite. I use it all the time, and there are a few reasons for this. One, it will let you lean away from EDH rec, and although EDH rec is an incredibly valuable tool to use, especially if you're sticking to a tight budget, you might not want to rely on it too heavily, since the cards that pop up on EDH rec are going to be the cards that everybody is using, which means that if you end up using only cards from EDH rec, your deck might not be as budget as it potentially could be. And learning how to go into the advanced search of Scryfall and using all of their tabs to find exactly what you're looking for, that's where you're going to find some of the most underrated cards, and you might even find a few cards that you want to put into some of your other not so budget decks. It's been incredibly useful, and you can even filter out cards above a certain price point. So you can cut off, let's say every card has to be under $1, you can cut that off, look, and every single card that you see is going to fit what you're looking for. And if you aren't comfortable with Scryfall, use it. It is invaluable. The third tip that I have is to stay away from popular strategies. This kind of goes hand in hand with the flavor of the month commanders. The reason for this is the staple cards are going to be incredibly expensive. The less popular a strategy is, the cheaper the cards will be. So if you want to build a strategy that is popular, you are going to have to make some serious cuts to it, or you are just going to have to accept the fact that these staple cards will not be in the deck. An example I've tried is Elves. Elves can be built under a budget, but the biggest weakness that I have come across is that you lack really good finishers. All the good finishers tend to be at least a few dollars, and if you aren't ready to spend a few dollars on a number of cards, then Elves might not be the absolute best bang for your buck. But this will also let you be creative with the cards that you slot in. You can find these unusual strategies, these unusual tribes that normally don't get built, that aren't in the spotlight, and then you can scoop up these cards and have a deck that still functions very well in this complete off-the-wall strategy that people generally don't run into, which is where you're going to find the cheap cards. But because not everything can be cheap, we're going to use that into our next tip, which is know where to splurge. Unless it's a super tight budget, there will be room for a few $1 to $5 cards, and it's crucial to know where those cards need to go. The place I always put it is ramp and card draw, because every deck needs these two things, no matter what. Every single deck needs ramp, and every single deck needs card draw. If your deck doesn't have these things, you'll just be sitting there doing nothing because you have an empty hand or you haven't hit your land drops, and it's just, your deck is going to be so inconsistent that even splurging just a few dollars on ramp and card draw, your suboptimal strategies will feel so much better and have so much more of an impact. However, don't bust the budget for one copy of Necropotence. Spread that money around on at least a few cards that you'll be more likely to hit. It'll feel good to hit that Smothering Tithe once in a while, but it won't happen often, and it's about making the deck as consistent as possible for as little as possible. Build the foundation, then look to build the rest. This is especially true in red and white, where both card draw and ramp just don't exist. This is where a good chunk of the money should go, and the reason why is because everybody's going to be looking for these cards. The good ramp and card draw spells are going to be at least a couple dollars, depending on which color you're in. Green and blue, you can get away with using some of the less popular card draw and ramp, but red and white needs the help, so just spend your money there. You won't regret it, just trust me. The next tip that I have for you is the few colors the better. Going back to consistency, having more colors to deal with adds to the variance of the deck. The cards that reduce the variance from adding more colors to a deck tend to cost a lot of money, and spending a huge portion of your budget on just non-basic lands gets very expensive very quickly. Having more basic lands also means that you can have more money for other things like ramp and card draw. And monocolor is going to be the best bang for your buck in terms of consistency. Each color you add is going to add more variance, as you now have to look for more and more colors before your deck can get rolling. If you want to have a lot of colors, you are just going to have to accept the fact that variance will be a part of the deck. The most amount of colors that I've had success with is about 3. I don't know if I would go higher than that. Of course, it depends on the actual budget that you are running with, but if you're trying to go for as cheap as possible, try to stick to 2 or 1 colors, or maybe 3 if you really want to build around a specific commander. And then my final tip isn't really a tip, but it's something to keep in mind, in that you can always add more later. What I mean by this is when you build the deck, that's not the final product. New cards are going to come out, you're going to be adjusting that deck, and if it's a deck that you actually really end up liking, then you can set aside a little bit of money each month, maybe $10, $15, $20 each month to go and buy slightly more expensive cards each time, and eventually you will have a full-fledged, not budget, fully tuned deck. And honestly, it's just fun just to sit and tune your deck and watch it improve and grow stronger over time. So all because a deck is budget now doesn't mean that it's going to be budget 5 months into the future. And that's pretty much all the tips that I have for you guys right now. Any deck can be built within a certain budget, but it really just boils down to consistency. Decks, to me, are at least more fun when you're doing something every game, and this is how I make sure I'm doing that while maintaining that strict budget. So if you really want to go for a certain strategy that has these more expensive cards in it, you're going to have to forego those expensive cards at first, maybe build up to it in the future, but just in the meantime accept that the deck may perform, it may not perform, and that variance is going to be a part of the experience. I've honestly been kind of obsessed with building budget decks for the past couple weeks or so. I really only meant to build maybe 1 or 2, but I've built at least 10 so far, and I don't really plan on stopping, so I may go over specific cards and decks in the future, so stay tuned. But anyway, thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to watch my video. I really do appreciate it. But now, if you'll excuse me, I'm about to browse the 5-cent bin at my local game store for the third time this week. Bye!